Our next speaker is Dr. Patrice Klein. She is the National Program Lead for Fish and Wildlife Health with USDA Forest Services. Her topic today will be One Health, One Welfare for Bats, Bioprinciples in the Field and in Wildlife Rehabilitation. Patrice?
Thank you very much. Okay, well, again, thank you and hello. It is a pleasure to participate in this Bat Welfare Symposium, and it's so wonderful to know how many people are attending because of your interest in bats and bat welfare. And in this presentation, I hope to make an important connection for you by linking the One Health and One Welfare through the principles and practices of biosecurity. So let's first consider the concept of One Health. We know that many of the complex challenges that influence or impact the health of people, animals, and the environment are challenges that cannot be solved by one sector alone. The report by the quadripartite, the One Health High-Level Expert Panel, or OLEP, defines One Health as an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. It recognizes the health of humans, domestic and wild animals, plants, and the wider environment are closely linked and are interdependent. Unfortunately, the environmental component of and its contribution to One Health is often overlooked. For example, there are human and animal health risks associated with climate change due to temperature shifts, fluctuations in rainfall, everything from drought to floods, extreme weather events, and extended severe wildfire seasons. And these can result in decreased air and water quality, exacerbate urban heat islands, and cause declines or loss of habitat and lead to a rise in and spread of emerging infectious vector-borne and zoonotic diseases, alterations in host pathogen interactions, and even shifts in disease patterns and seasonality. So One Health is a useful framework. It's looking at the interactive relationships between the health of humans, animals, and our shared ecosystem. But the integrated disease management approach is an epidemiological approach that uses the disease triangle framework to also recognize the interactive relationships between pathogens, susceptible hosts, and the environment, and identify ways to interrupt the disease transmission cycle. So today, let's also recognize and appreciate how health and welfare or well-being of people and animals are also interrelated and interactive. I actually want to thank Brian Pope, who earlier this morning was talking about the 5 domains. I'm just going to go back through a little bit of that in a little more detail. So the original model was called the 5 freedoms. The 5 freedoms was a concept of animal welfare originally developed in the UK in the 1960s, and it focused on minimizing negative physical and functional behaviors such as thirst or hunger, discomfort, pain, injury, disease, fear, distress, and even the inability to express normal behavior, and how those negative factors affected animal welfare. But the concept was reformulated to the 5 domains model by Dave Mellor and Cam Reed in 1994, and more recently updated in 2020, which is an example of the diagram you see here on the slide. The 5 domains model is systematic and comprehensive framework for assessing animal welfare risks and enhancements. So the model consists of these 5 areas or domains that focus attention on specific factors or conditions that may impact an animal's welfare. As you see here on the slide, the first 4 are sort of physical and functional domains, including nutrition, living environment, health and fitness, and even the behavioral interactions. That 5th domain, called mental state, that is now more broadly emphasizes the overall mental state of the animal. Now, while the first 3 domains consider mostly like internal physiological states within the animal, that 4th domain, or the behavioral one, considers the animal's behavioral interactions with external sort of physical and social surroundings to include the environment, other animals, and people. The cumulative outcome, though, is of both positive and negative experiences that are integrated in that 5th domain and then actually represent the overall animal's current welfare state. Just looking at this a little bit more in detail, let's look at this brief comparison between what we call the 5 freedoms and now what we call the 5 domains. And this was an example that was described by the World Animal Protection Organization. So again, the 5 freedoms really focused on minimizing negative experiences to promote animal well-being. And those negative experiences were called the freedoms: freedom from hunger and thirst, from discomfort, pain, injury, disease, fear and distress, and even the freedom to actually express normal behavior, or on the negative side, to not be able to express normal behavior. But if you now look at the domains, they're looking more at the positive features. They're looking at, for example, nutrition, that the animal should actually have access to a well-balanced diet, to have clean food and water. For environment, the animal should have a comfort through comfortable temperature or space, or shelter, or even just predictability in their environment. Health, again, is on the positive side. They should be in good health and good body condition and in good fitness, and avoid some of the things that would cause disease and injury. On behavior, again, that domain number 4, these animals should have the ability to have good sensory inputs, to have foraging opportunities or bonding or enrichment, as we talked about, both on the captive side or even on the wild side, and enjoy those outcomes. And then the mental state would be that mental state where they benefit more from the predominant positive experiences or states and less impacted by the negative ones. So whereas the 5 domains broaden this concept to not only minimize the negative experiences, but also enable the positive experiences to ensure the highest welfare of the animal's life. And so to reiterate, the health of the animal, be it freedom from hunger and thirst or freedom from pain, injury, and disease, is directly related to its welfare state. So let's consider how we can protect the health and welfare of animals. In this case, we're talking about bats, using the principles of biosecurity. So in the United States, there are several federal laws and policies that protect the health and welfare of animals and people, looking in one case in animal research settings. And let's see how we can actually link these together. So in 1985, the Animal Welfare Act under USDA was amended to establish institutional animal care and use committees with the animal care and use programs at animal research facilities. But also in 1985, the Interagency Research Animal Committee, or IRAC, which is a group of federal government agencies, they pledged to extend these Animal Welfare Act standards and regulations to cover all vertebrate species. And in doing so, they established what we call the U.S. government principles for the utilization and care of vertebrate animals used in testing, research, and training, which states in part that the proper use of animals, including the avoidance or minimization of discomfort, distress, and pain, when consistent with sound scientific practices, is imperative. More so, unless the contrary is established, investigators should consider that procedures that cause pain and distress in people may also cause pain and distress in other animals. Furthermore, NIH, Office of Lab Animal Welfare, in their Public Health Service or PHS policy, and the National Research Council both require occupational health and safety programs for people at animal research facilities. And this is actually referenced in the PHS Guide to the Care and Use of Animals in Research. Further, that the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, has safety and health standards to protect people from exposure to various hazards. Examples include that they have a respiratory protection standard to require respirators against airborne pathogens. They also have a bloodborne pathogen standard to require wearing personal protective equipment, or PPE, and/or to receive appropriate vaccinations against those types of bloodborne pathogens. But the important takeaway here is that the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or the IACUC, and the Occupational Health and Safety programs must be partners in protecting both the health and well-being of the animals and the people, and that a biosafety risk assessment should be completed for all animal activities. So let's see how this partnership should work. Well, let's define biosecurity. So biosecurity is defined as, well, bio meaning life and security, protection. It comprises measures to prevent the introduction and spread of harmful biological agents, to protect you, other people, and animals from the risk of exposure to and introduction of infectious pathogens. Fundamentally, this means having situational awareness to understand what hazards, including biological hazards or pathogens, may be present in the environment in which you are working or in the animal population, and what are the risks of pathogen exposure and the routes of transmission, and how to best mitigate those risks. Emergency and contingency response plans are important for any biosecurity breaches, especially for any infectious and zoonotic pathogen exposure. And as we discuss and focus on bats, this would include rabies, SARS-CoV-2, histoplasmosis, and even white nose syndrome. And in this case, I'm really reflecting both the risks for people and animals, or people and bats. But constant vigilance is essential, and situational awareness is key to preventing and avoiding these situations. So again, situational awareness is needed to understand what the biological agents might be present in your work area, the susceptibility of the species that you're working with, and what risks your activities might entail. Specifically, plan before you act. Develop a site-specific biosecurity or biosafety plan to identify pathogen risks and appropriate exposure prevention practices, and use practical and systematic procedures to ensure consistency and compliance. Using this information, you can develop what we call risk mitigation measures using various tools, such as the hierarchy of control as risk assessment, and I'll explain that in a moment, and determine the appropriate biosecurity level and the type of personal protective equipment, or PPE, that's necessary. Ultimately, you must be proactive and take personal responsibility to assess all the risks. Stay aware of the circumstances in which you and the animals, in this case bats, are situated, because these may change. So you're also responsible for knowing the sources of the pathogenic agents and the routes of exposure to them. Remember, there's an important distinction between infectious and contagious agents. An infectious agent is capable of causing an infection, but it may or may not be contagious. A contagious agent or disease is an infection that is readily transmissible between susceptible hosts. So sources of infectious pathogens can be from contaminated food and water. It could also happen during animal handling. As a rule, the order of handling animals should consider the disease risk and the susceptibility of the animals. For example, young animals that tend to be more susceptible than adults should be handled first. And healthy animals should always be handled before sick animals to minimize the risk of disease spread. Housing and equipment are also sources of infectious agents that are listed here on the slide. Cages, crates, holding pens, even bedding material. If you're working in the field or maybe at a facility, nets, other equipment, gear, instruments that you might be using, certainly waders, boots, safety gear, climbing gear, all of these things that can become contaminated. If you're inside a facility, exam tables, of course, countertops, cages, we said that before, sinks, food and water bowls, anything that can act as a fomite that's going to move pathogenic agents from one place to the next. So therefore, it's important to maintain effective biosecurity measures at all stages by limiting the handling and the contact of the animals and having effective isolation, cleaning and disinfection, or decontamination procedures in place. You also need to know the likely routes of transmission of pathogens, or those that could be introduced by your activities. This could be via inhalation, direct contact, or environmental contamination. So for example, SARS-CoV-2 is a highly contagious virus via aerosol transmission that can infect susceptible bat and other animal species, obviously humans. Pseudogymnoascus destructans, that's the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, is highly infectious and contagious between susceptible bat species. Even ectoparasites, mites and ticks and other ectoparasites on bats are easily transmitted by direct contact, or sometimes in bedding or in the environment that can sometimes affect people as well. And I do have to note that rabies virus, of course, is most commonly transmitted by bites between animals, so the infected animal to the next, such as bats biting other bats, or of course, biting humans. And this reminds me of the photo I had to put in on the top of the slide with the magic red X, which is the no bare hands moment. So this is a very unhappy bat anyway, because the person who's holding the bat is holding the bat with bare hands. And we all know that that certainly exposes that person potentially to being bitten, and that is likely or potentially a rabies vector species, and that would be a rabies suspect issue. So please don't do that. Other routes of transmission from environmental sources can include consumption of infected animals or carcasses, ingestion again of contaminated water sources, or contact with contaminated field gear. So whether you're working in the field or in wildlife rehabilitation facilities, it is best to assume that every animal can harbor a pathogen, and you don't want to risk spreading it to other animals or people. And therefore ensure that appropriate measures to prevent pathogen exposure and transmission at all stages by limiting the handling and contact of the animals, using appropriate personal protective equipment, and having effective cleaning and disinfection procedures in place. It's really easy to contaminate either a field site or a facility if basic biosecurity measures are not employed effectively and consistently. And just a quick shout out, the photo on the bottom right corner of the slide is actually from the White Nose Syndrome Disease Management Working Group. It's actually a photo taken from their most recently updated White Nose Syndrome Decontamination Protocol as of March 2024. And it just reinforces how important it is that if you finish your work for the day, if you're at a field site or even at a facility, how important it is to clean your buckets and all your gear and all your outer clothing, whether it's coveralls or it's waders, whatever, boots, etc. And obviously clean and disinfect them. And it's certainly, if you're lucky and have a really good sunny day, you can also let them hang outside and dry in the sunshine and take advantage of the UV light. And I would be remiss if I did not reiterate that all warm-blooded animals, mammals, and some birds are susceptible to rabies virus. And I want to again thank Dr. Wellen, who mentioned rabies, of course, very specifically and genetically in his lecture. Thank you for that. But the known rabies reservoir species are listed on the slide, including the Chiroptera. And we know that the Western Hemisphere bat species that evolve very differently than our Eastern Hemisphere species are the host for rabies virus here in the Western Hemisphere, and the Eastern Hemisphere bat species are the host for that rabies-related lyssavirus. Rabies virus has been reported in every continent except Australia. Of course, Australia has their Australian bat lyssavirus. And there are still 6 distinct rabies virus variants. And although in the United States, we were declared canine rabies variant free in 2008, the other rabies virus variants still are present in the United States. So rabies still is a very significant public health and animal health risk worldwide, including for many bat species. So let's consider how to develop these risk mitigation measures to protect health and welfare. The hierarchy of control, which is depicted here in this upside down triangle, was developed by the CDC, National Institutes of Occupational Safety and Health, as a risk assessment tool for critical thinking to identify and mitigate risks from various hazards, biological, chemical, physical, to protect health and safety. The diagram in this upside down triangle shows how these controls are ordered from least effective to most effective. But note that the personal protective equipment, or PPE, is actually the least effective because it can fail if it's not used properly. For example, if you don't change your disposable gloves or gloves between handling animals, if you don't get fit tested for certain types of face masks, etc. So using PPE is good, but it's also best if it's used in combination with administrative and engineering controls. And we'll give examples of that in a moment. The only way to completely reduce the risk, or any risk, to zero is actually to eliminate it. But that would mean, in our case, stopping field work or don't rehabilitate at-risk animals. However, we can actually use this hierarchy of control tool to allow these activities to continue, provided the risks can be minimized by incorporating PPE, administrative, and engineering controls. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So there are various levels of personal protective equipment depending on the risk or the hazard to be addressed. But when in doubt, put it on. For example, there's different types of face masks that have different functions. Surgical masks reduce aerosols produced by the person who's wearing the mask, by the wearer, to protect others, while N95 type masks and respirators that require fit testing for proper use actually protect the wearer, the person wearing them, from inhaling external pathogens or other hazardous airborne substances. On the bottom line, though, is that face masks will serve to reduce aerosol risks at some level. So again, better on than off. PPE should be consistently and properly worn, regularly inspected, maintained, and replaced as necessary. It should also be properly removed, cleaned, stored, or disposed of to avoid contamination of yourself, of others, and of the environment. Also, keep a record of everyone with animal contact in case any subsequent disease issues need follow-up. So let's talk about administrative controls. Administrative controls are procedures and protocols. They're written things, written documents for routine and emergency facility operations that include biosafety or biosecurity practices. Some examples are listed here on the slide. They are things like hygiene and sanitation guidelines, quarantine and isolation procedures, cleaning and disinfection or decontamination protocols. They can even be training and work shift schedules, or general animal record keeping, or can be capture, handling, and release protocols, any and all of the above. Emergency plans should also outline contingencies for staffing, animal care, food and medical supplies, communication, and reporting to authorities. This would include an institution's policy, for example, for self-reporting by personnel of any disease exposure, any bite wounds, for example, rabies suspect situations, or any health risks to people and animals. The National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association and the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council jointly published the minimum standards for wildlife rehabilitation, which is pictured here. It includes comprehensive guidelines, particularly on biosecurity practices, on disinfection procedures, and animal welfare practices in wildlife rehabilitation. This particular guide is the current edition in 2021, and it's an excellent resource. Engineering controls consist of the physical things, physical actions implemented to reduce hazards and protect people and animals from those risks in the field and in captive settings. For example, posting signage to restrict entering access to buildings or outdoor caging, field sites is important. Also, wildlife rehabilitation centers should limit public access to their facilities. Unauthorized people should not be able to walk into the building. They should not be able to walk through the animal wards or even go visit the outdoor cages. Proper and separate ventilation systems should be maintained in animal rooms and in office or work areas where people are. Outdoor cages should be protected from pests, from other animal contact. All caging, equipment, boots, coveralls, and even vehicles should be properly cleaned and disinfected between uses, in captive settings, and even between field sites. So let's see how these biosecurity and risk assessments have been put into practice. During the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a potential concern for reverse zoonoses. In other words, infected humans, people infected with SARS-CoV-2, transmitting that virus to animals. And this was reported in some susceptible pet animals such as dogs, cats, and ferrets, and in certain wildlife species by direct contact or in close proximity. Concerns were raised that SARS-CoV-2 could be transmitted to susceptible bat species, particularly here in North America, by recreational activities such as caving, or capture and handling bats in field research, or during wildlife rehabilitation activities with bats in care. Consequences that could result might include disease spread between those infected bats, actually bat mortality, or establishment of disease reservoirs in those bats, and risk to conservation efforts. So the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, their bat specialist group, developed guidelines on mitigation strategies to reduce the risk of reverse zoonosis in bats. Their diagram here, which was in 2021, is depicted on the slide. And if you look at the left side, you'll see that they identified some key exposure risks to bats from people. It could be aerosol, infected people coughing, sneezing, or even holding bats in close proximity could expose them to infectious aerosol droplets of virus. Or environmental exposure, if people are working in poorly ventilated or enclosed spaces like hibernacula or caves, where bats also occupy, they could have expelled virus that could persist in the air on surfaces that bats could be exposed to. And also direct contact, if they're handling bats with contaminated hands or equipment. So they looked at mitigation strategies, and just to identify the one called Protect is, again, adopting good field hygiene, wearing your personal protective equipment, and following disinfection procedures. In addition, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. federal and state wildlife agencies collaborated to conduct risk assessments on North American wildlife based on increasing scientific knowledge on virus transmission and species susceptibilities for what we knew at that time. In 2020, there was a proposed list of at-risk wildlife that was created based on experimental and natural infections, several susceptibility modeling studies using ACE2 receptors, and even some infectivity studies, usually on big brown bats as one of the animal models. The U.S. Geological Service led an interagency and interdisciplinary team to conduct a SARS-CoV-2 risk assessment for bats, and also conducted some experimental infectivity studies on big brown bats and on Mexican free-tail bats at the National Wildlife Health Center. Similarly, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, or AFWA, developed biosecurity guidance on bats and SARS-CoV-2 in 2020, and subsequently additional guidance was developed on mustelids and felids and canids a little bit later that year. Many federal and state wildlife agencies developed their own guidelines based on the known science and risk factors of the time, and with the intention to be consistent with partners in their region. So again, these are examples of how we put the hierarchy of controls into practice. Now, here's also some examples of implementing risk mitigation measures for bats that are in care at wildlife rehabilitation facilities using the hierarchy of control risk assessment to establish administrative engineering and PPE control practices. Biosecurity. First, bats must be housed in dedicated and secure rooms within the facility with restricted signage on the entry door. Any staff that's working with bats must have received prophylactic rabies vaccination, and this of course applies to all rabies vector species, and also they must wear proper PPE. Minimally, it's gloves, and in some cases, when we worried about SARS-CoV-2, we were also wearing appropriate face masks to make sure we might not be spreading any disease to the animals. Dedicated housing must be able to be disinfected between use, and shown here on various photos on this slide are these nylon mesh housing containers that also have these soft cloth bedding in there, and also hanging for the bats to hang from or hide underneath or in, and their food and water bowls that are housed with the individual bats. These are each washed separately and obviously disinfected. Now, the food and the water bowls, and even the example of the handling gloves that are in use, are actually kept with the same bat and with the same housing container. So everything is a unit. The other dedicated supplies and equipment and PPE are stored properly in the bat room to avoid cross-contamination in a central supply area. The other thing that's important here as well is proper husbandry. You have to also maintain proper room temperature, humidity, ventilation are essential to maintain bat health and welfare. And remember, bats that are in wildlife rehabilitation facilities are generally recovering from an injury or disease. So we will have to maintain them at sort of an active, metabolically active situation for humidity and temperature, and also ventilation. And record keeping is also maintained for individual bats that corresponds to their caging. You can see some examples of records that are being near where the caging is, but in association with those respective bats. And that's seen in some of these photos. And also there's complete electronic medical records that are also kept for each bat in a computer database. So also, I just wanted to note from Amanda Lawler's lecture this morning that yes, it's true that food and water dishes really should not be on a cage floor. But remember, many of these bats are actually recovering from injuries or some illness. So even though you do see the small containers there, those are temporary while they're in this sort of hospitalization situation. Once these animals are moved outdoors or into larger indoor cages, then yes, indeed, the food and the water is suspended off the floor. And there's also enrichment that's provided to them with, hanging natural plants and branches in those cages. So the hierarchy of control, these engineering controls are also used to construct outdoor caging for bats to actually protect bats from unwanted intruders and to prevent their escape prematurely. Remember that bats can squeeze through really tiny gaps, 1/4 of an inch or less. And so we really need to protect them while they're in our care in these outdoor enclosures. Also, in mind that there's a double door entry system that should happen for any of these outdoor cages, but particularly for bats, double door entry. So what does that mean? That the individual enters from the outside through that first door. They enter and they close the door behind them. They're in a vestibule, and they close that entry door behind them before they open up the interior door. And that interior door into the main part of the cage actually opens in. So in case whether it's a bird or a bat, but if any animal is trying to come towards you, opening that interior door is going to actually push them back into the cage or prevent them from trying to get out. The other thing that you may not be able to appreciate, but it's shown here on the far right photo, is that within that wooden framed cage is soft screen mesh that lines all the walls and the ceiling, so that it's a nice soft screen that the animals can fly and hang onto, or they can certainly, in case they're flying around, they're not going to be injured by any of the wooden framing. And it's reinforced at the seams. So where that mesh might overlap, there's definitely reinforcement to make sure none of the bats can actually get between the seams of the nylon mesh and not get it entrapped between the mesh and the outer frame of the cage. So the caging is actually designed to support also the 5 domains model, to provide the physical exercise, the behavioral stimulation, and general acclimation prior to their release. The other thing I just want to kind of reiterate, and I've mentioned it several times in the lecture already, and others have talked about it as well, as disinfection. So I'm a disinfection girl. Okay, I like to clean. We've talked about that several times, and I wanted to reiterate that there are ideal properties for disinfectants, and you have to choose the appropriate product for the proper use. And looking at the list here, just remember, for these sort of ideal properties, they should be efficacious for a broad spectrum of infectious agents. They can be economical, or should be, so they're low cost and readily available. We want them to act fast. So in other words, minimize that contact time between the chemical and the surface, and really, fast act and be really efficacious. Obviously, we want them to be relatively safe for humans and animals, no residual toxicity, absence of irritating odors. One thing I do want to point out is this idea that they should be active in the presence of organic debris. But not all not all disinfectants are. For example, bleach is one of the disinfectants that is not active in the presence of organic material. So what does that mean? Bleach is a great disinfectant, but before you can use the bleach to disinfect the item, you have to first remove the organic material. That could be feces, blood, urine, residual food, mud, dirt, anything else that is an organic material that has to be either washed off, rinsed off, or washed off with soap and water, or scrubbed or scraped off first. And then you have a second step, which is then come back and use the bleach, which again is an excellent disinfection. That's why people have a tendency to go to more potent disinfectants that actually remain active in the presence of organic debris, but use caution, because some of those could be corrosive to your equipment or your utensils or your instruments. So you, again, need to read the label and look at the EPA registered and labeled products. There's a website link here that you can look at for EPA registered products. And remember that you not only read the label, but use them as directed. And it's a suitability of purpose. So pick the right one for the right reason, and don't misuse disinfectants because they can lead to antimicrobial resistance. So the most important is to check the EPA website for the disinfectant product registration guidance. The other web link I put here is actually for the whitenosesyndrome.org website. And again, that is referring to that white nose syndrome decontamination protocol, most recently updated in March of 2024. So the summary of biosecurity is really effective biosecurity relies on everyone doing their parts well and consistently every day. The procedures need to be practical and incorporated at all levels so that doing them becomes normal. And everyone understands the importance of full compliance to maximize the health and welfare of animals and people and minimize disease risk. Biosecurity is truly an investment which protects the health and welfare of animals and people, and it promotes a healthy environment. This exemplifies those 1Health principles we talked about at the beginning and recognizes the interconnection of health and welfare as modeled by the 5 domains. So I've just given you a little bit of resources here, not exhaustive, but a few things that we touched on in this presentation. There's a link for the IUCN for information, again, by the BAT specialist working group. Also, the whitenosesyndrome.org website is listed here for that white nose syndrome decontamination protocol. And there's even references through CDC, mostly either for coronaviruses, SARS-CoV-2, others, rabies, and even histoplasmosis, which again is of risk for people. So there's just some information that hopefully will be of use to you. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Patrice. First question. I understand the need for proper protection is taken depending on the situation you're in. but is there a balanced method of PPE that we can take? This is reminding me of a statement made earlier that peanut allergies are a first world problem and not something or something seen worldwide. Wouldn't we inadvertently potentially doing the same thing by completely eliminating all exposure?
Well, and with disinfectant, that's different than sterilization. That's a distinction, and I think that's a good point to make. So when we go ahead and disinfect, we're not necessarily sterilizing the environment, if I'm interpreting the question correctly. So a little goes a long way. The idea is to minimize the risk of exposure to pathogens. There's very good bacteria out there as well, we know that, or other, microbes. So what we're trying to do is to maintain as clean and a situation as possible so that you're minimizing the risk of disease spread or pathogen introduction. You're not taking it down to zero. And no matter where you are in the world, I've traveled fair enough that I've given some of these lectures, and it's amazing, even if you have anything but soap and water, it's amazing what you can get accomplished with soap and water and maybe drying in the sunshine. So it's really the community of practice is to just be aware that you need to minimize what you bring into the situation. So for example, with white nose syndrome, we don't know for sure, but we also believe that it could have been easily introduced by folks who are spelunkers and cavers who do this recreationally and with no malintention, but when they go from cave to cave and enjoy their recreational activities, they likely were bringing in contaminated equipment and boots because nobody suggested that they needed to disinfect or sanitize their equipment moving between one cave and the next. But this was an international issue. This fungus, we believe, has come from other parts of the world and has been introduced into North America. So what a little soap and water or a little bit of disinfection might have prevented is perhaps a moot point, but it's learning lessons from that and making sure that we're trying to do things as properly as possible.
Okay, thank you. How should leather gloves be decontaminated?
That's a good question because we do have a lot of gloves, oftentimes using them with raptors or even in caving and climbing and stuff. Sometimes you just have to realize that if you're going to try to clean them, whether it's even trying to put them in some hot water and or use anything that's topical, at some point the leather may wear and become old and needs to be replaced. So some of that, the other option is to also dedicate those gloves if you're only using them, let's say, for bats and you don't use them for any other animals. So part of that is kind of deciding and discriminating how you want to use certain PPE only dedicated for certain animals, and you can try to do at least surface cleaning in between rather than trying to do more challenging disinfectant of some things that are absorbent as well. So I'm not sure if I had a perfect answer for you, but you have to think critically to decide, do you want to just dedicate certain gloves to certain species or certain animals and then discard them? Or do you want to try to maybe put, let's say, a disposable latex glove over the outer part of the leather glove so that that's the part that gets dirty and then you can just take that off and throw it away at the end.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I always thought that we didn't have to worry about rabies in birds, but your slide lists that they are also susceptible.
I know, and I was surprised too. So there's been at least a case, I believe, in an owl, and I know there was definitely a report that I read about chickens. The chickens, this was in a different part of the world, but the chickens were actually bitten by a rabid dog, like backyard flock chickens in a village, and it took them about a week until they started showing some neurological signs. And it's really stunning to me that somebody took the time to actually consider rabies, but the dog they knew had been rabid. And when they realized that the chickens about a week later after they had been bitten showed neurological signs and some of them died, they did actually do necropsies and tested them for rabies and they were positive. So I agree with you. I was actually surprised myself, but that yes, there are some birds that may show minimal signs, neurological signs. They could just be lethargic, but it was realizing that rabies is for all warm-blooded animals. And so we really do need to include the birds as well.
Okay, thank you, Patrice.